Hi, everyone, and welcome back for part two of chapter one for Psych 3510. We're going to pick up where we left off, finishing up part one, where we're going to dive right into science and the process of science, as well as scientists, and, for example, how they approach their work. So the remainder of the chapter in this lecture is going to focus on these few core ideas that scientists are empiricists. We'll talk about what that means. We're going to discuss how they test theories, the difference between applied and basic problems, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the publication process of science, how science is disseminated to other scientists, and then we're going to talk about the issue of science reporting or science journalism, and that's how science gets from scientists to the broader public. Okay, so scientists are empiricists. This means that the process of science starts with the assumption that all knowledge is derived from sensory experience and the measurement of that sensory experience. So basically, if you can't see it, hear it, feel it, or measure it, it doesn't count as the domain of science. Right? Science concerns itself only with repeatable, observable, measurable phenomena. If something falls outside of those boundaries, then we do not consider it to be within the scientific realm. So what this means is that we have to, when we begin the scientific process, we have to make sure that our question is an empirical question. So an empirical question is one that is able to be answered and tested by observation and measurement. So we have to approach the world with this mindset of empiricism. However, there are issues with the creation of non-empirical questions. Right? This would be a statement or a question or a hypothesis that is unable to be tested within the scientific method. So, for example, I could claim that the thing that makes you fall in love are imaginary fairies, right, that shoot you with Cupid's arrow, and the first person you see, you fall in love with. Right? That would be a non-empirical claim because it makes a claim about something that falls outside the boundaries of the scientific world, of the measurable world. Right? Imaginary fairies with Cupid's arrow. Right? I can't possibly create a situation where I could measure that. Versus an empirical question about maybe relationships or love could be something like, how does proximity determine whether or not you will fall in love with someone? Meaning, are long distance relationships, more or less successful than proximate relationships where you're physically with someone? Right? That's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, especially in today's technological age of dating. And we could come up with many different ways to sort of create a scenario in the world where we could collect data and measure some important constructs about whether being proximate or with someone while you're dating is different from a long-distance relationship. Now, it's pretty easy to come up with empirical questions. It's a little more difficult to come up with examples of non-empirical questions. However, you can think about non-empirical questions in a way as sort of falling, many of them fall into sort of the opinion camp, right? They're not really a testable question. It's just what someone thinks. It's someone's opinion. So I really enjoy chess. I could make the claim that chess is the best board game in the world. Chess is the best board game in the world. It's a claim. I'm making that claim. I'm telling you that I think chess is the best board game in the world. But it's difficult to see how you could measure or quantify that, right? Like, I guess we could do like a survey of people about board games and see what board games are rated more highly, but that's just again, ratings. That's not. I made the claim that it's the best board game. What does best even mean in this scenario? So it's difficult to ascertain how I could effectively answer that question. It's just my opinion. It's just something I'm saying. Versus, I could make the empirical claim that I am the best chess player in my neighborhood. And it might take a little bit of running around and work, but I could go around and play everyone in my neighborhood in chess. I could conceive of a scenario where I can test that claim because it's an empirical claim. I can play 100 chess matches in a big tournament with my entire neighborhood and see how many of them I win versus how many someone else wins. Right? It's a testable claim because it lends itself to observation and measurement. Okay, so let's talk about the sort of research cycle. So really quickly here, the first thing you want to do is choose a phenomena, right? Pick a topic to study. So let's continue using that example from earlier, long distance relationships. Let's just say I'm interested in the success rate of long distance relationships. Maybe I'm a social psychologist, right, or a clinical psychologist who studies relationships. And it's important to note that when I pick my phenomena, there's already, probably at this point in time, there's already a bunch of research that's sort of related to that phenomena. We've been doing, intimate partner relationship research for decades at this point. I could go back and I could read studies and research that has been published on relationships. There's probably even been some work done on distance relationships. Maybe my new wrinkle is going to be about the addition of technology or something like that. But it's important to note that when I pick my phenomena, I'm not just grabbing things out of thin air and making stuff up. I'm looking at previous research, previous work that has been published on the topic, and then I'm basing my choice of phenomena on that established work and established theory. So the next thing I want to do is generate a novel, unique hypothesis. So a question that no one has asked before in the research, so that if I answer that question, I can add something new to our understanding of my phenomena. So maybe I want to study long distance relationships for people in their 20s who met online and have never met in person before, right? That's kind of an interesting, unique wrinkle to relationships now with technology, is that I could study people in long distance relationships who've never physically even been in the same room with each other. So I want to understand, what are those relationships like? Are they different from proximate relationships? And so I could go out and survey and collect data on people in relationships with other people that they have never physically met before. And so maybe I want to understand something about the intensity of their emotions, or this is an interesting one with long distance relationships, how they deal with jealousy, right? So sexual jealousy is a large component of relationships, making sure or wanting your partner not to be with other people, and your partner wanting the same thing of you generally. And it presents a really interesting and unique problem for long distance relationships. So maybe I want to study sexual jealousy in technologically long distance relationships. Boom, right? Now I have this really interesting research question, and I can say that I hypothesize that people in long distance relationships will exhibit more sexual jealousy than people in proximate relationships, because the distance from their partner makes them more vigilant. They want to be more controlling. Maybe they're a little more overbearing and jealous because they're not physically there to meet their partner's sexual needs. Then, of course, I can test my hypothesis. I collect the data, and then I analyze it. I draw conclusions, and then I sort of circle back around and I introduce my findings to the literature, to the sort of broader collection of findings in that area, and we see how it fits, right? This is all the stuff that I based my picking of a phenomena off of, right? I looked at all the other research, at all the other theories that existed about relationships, and I chose a phenomena, and I've gone through this cycle, and now I'm going to end up back at sort of where I started. I'm going to add to the literature. I'm going to add to our understanding. And that additional piece of information is going to prompt new questions. It's going to prompt new phenomena. So this cycle never, ever stops, right? We answer a question, and the answer, a good answer to a question, prompts two more questions, right? It just creates more interesting scenarios. So let's say I find that distance partners have greater amounts of sexual jealousy. So now my question is, well, how does that impact the relationship? Or my question is, are there strategies that they can use to mitigate the negative effects of that sexual jealousy in their relationship? So answering my first question prompts more questions that I can research and that I can investigate. And so it just never stops. Science just is this iterative process where it just keeps going and going and going. Now, a really interesting sort of way to think about setting up a research question is to pit two theories against each other and come up with a scenario that would allow us to distinguish between the two theories and have one of them be maybe correct, one of them be incorrect, or they could both be incorrect, right? We take two ideas, two established theories, and we actively pit them against each other. A really, really good example of this was a very early experiment in developmental psychology on what's called attachment by Harry Harlow. I might get the date wrong. I believe like 1958, late 50s, early 60s, something like that. Harlow looked out at the sort of base of knowledge about how young children attach to generally their parent, but we'll just say an attachment figure, right? An adult who's caretaking for them. And Harlow saw two competing theories. He saw what was known as the cupboard theory, which was that children attach to adults because adults provide them with survival, right? They provide them with food and nutrition and water, things that they need. And so the child develops this relationship with the adult in order to survive, and so that they can get the required sustenance and nutrition that they need. There was a competing theory of attachment called the contact comfort theory, and this was more emotionally based. This theory said, yes, obviously children need to eat and drink to survive, but really the basis of attachment is an emotional comfort with an adult figure. Children are going to get scared. Children are going to hurt themselves. Children are exploring the world. And in all of those situations, what they really desire and what they really need is an emotional comfort attachment figure that can help guide them through those issues. And so Harlow said, these are two competing theories trying to explain the same phenomena. Let's pit them against each other. And so he used infant rhesus macaques. That's this little primate over here that you see in the image. And he gave them the choice. He gave them a comfort surrogate mother that had like a now when you look at it, quite terrifying depiction of a macaque mother's face. But it has a face, right? It's got eyes and ears and a mouth, and it kind of looks like a little bit of a monkey. And then the body of this mother was comfortable. It was like terry cloth. It's soft and soothing and enjoyable to be on. So they could choose between spending time on the comfort mother, or they could spend time on the cupboard mother, which was cold and wire and metal, a little bit of a face, but not a engaging face. But the cupboard mother had food. The cupboard mother would provide sustenance, whereas the comfort mother had no food. And so Harlow basically just would turn infant rhesus macaques loose and measure how much time they spent interacting with each surrogate mother. And so we can see that this is a very clear opportunity to test these two competing theories, because you simply have to measure the amount of time spent with the cupboard mother versus spent with the comfort mother. And there you go. You have your answer about which theory wins. In fact, what ended up happening, the comfort mother won, as we can see in this image. But what the macaques would do is they would spend time with the comfort mother, and then when they got hungry, they'd run over and they'd nurse from the cupboard mother, and then they'd run right back to the comfort mother. So they needed food, right? We can't deny that the macaques need food, but they prefer to spend time with the comfort mother. And so Harlow used this result to argue for a more emotionally based system of attachment. So let's talk about good scientific theories. So in general, we want to think of a theory as a collection of findings. When we use the word theory sort of in day-to-day colloquial language, theory means like a guess, right? I've got a theory about who keyed my car, right? Whatever. We use theory to just mean a guess, an idea. But that's not how we use theory in the world of science. When we call something a theory, it means it's actually an explanation, a good explanation for a collection of facts, of findings. So you might have a collection of literature on a subject, and then you sort of see how all of those things interact with each other, how all of those individual findings build to a larger picture. And that larger picture that explains those findings is what we call a theory. So in science, when we call something a theory, that doesn't diminish it, it actually amplifies it. A theory has been supported by research. So good scientific theories and good scientific questions are obviously supported by data. That's number one, right? If you can't just come up with a theory out of thin air, right? It needs to be supported by results. Ideas and theories need to be falsifiable, meaning they need to be able to be proven wrong. This goes back to sort of our sticking point about empiricism, right? If I can't measure it, I can't prove it wrong. It's not falsifiable. And a good example of claims that are not falsifiable are many religious claims. So we'll just kind of make a very general religious claim that a supernatural being created the universe, right? Whatever that supernatural being is, we're not getting into that. A supernatural being created the universe. That's the claim. From a scientific perspective, that claim is problematic because it's not falsifiable. I can't disprove the existence of a supernatural being by definition because they are supernatural, right? They are beyond nature. They are immeasurable. They are not quantifiable. They do not exist in space or location and time in the way that we understand them from the scientific method. And so those claims fall outside the boundary of science. We cannot use science. Those claims cannot be brought into a scientific arena because they're not falsifiable. Good theories are parsimonious, meaning they are simple. We want to keep things as unencumbered as possible when we try and explain the world. Now, that doesn't mean that complex explanations are always wrong. It just means that if given the choice between a complex explanation and a simple explanation, and given that they are equally good, right, given that they explain the phenomena equally well, we prefer the simple explanation. And lastly, and this is an interesting point that is also difficult to understand, gets into what's known as really the philosophy of science. Science doesn't, quote unquote, prove anything with a capital P. Science is an iterative process that tests its own claims, that self-corrects, that changes over time. and science finds when it's wrong and fixes it, right? So what we don't want to do is use the sort of ultimate endpoint terminology and language like prove, because things that were claimed at one point in time end up being shown to not be the case later. Whoops. Sorry about that. Got a little ahead of myself. So we don't want to make these long-lasting claims because we want to acknowledge that science changes, and the way that we can measure the world and the way that we can investigate the world changes. So just a simple example from the world of psychology. Up until really the 90s, it was very difficult to measure the brain. You could do a little bit with like electrical caps that would measure some electrical activity, but we had a really difficult time measuring the brain for obvious reasons. And then in the 90s, this interesting technology called fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, was developed, where we could actually sort of peek into the brain and see its activity without, damaging anything. And this led to a whole host of sort of new findings, and we overturned old findings that we now knew were incorrect about the way the brain works, because suddenly we have this amazing new technology that allows us to do something new and different. And so those findings from, let's just say, the 60s and the 70s that were making claims about the brain, many of them turned out to be incorrect. At the time, in the 60s and the 70s, it's the best you could do. And you can only do the best you can do with the technology and the measurement that you have. But when this new technology came out, this fMRI, it allowed us to go, oh, now we can really answer these questions. Now we know that, okay, these 5 claims turned out to be incorrect. These 5 claims turned out to be correct. And we can confirm that with this new technology. So we want to sort of take a step back and acknowledge that the process of science is just that. It's a process. Science is not the process of knowing everything all at once perfectly. Science is the process of slowly grinding and finding bit by bit and piece by piece to a puzzle that fits together, that will ultimately produce knowledge. But that process can take some time, and it's not necessarily a straight line, right? It can dip and move and shift and change as we go through time. So falsifiable, as we said, a scientific experiment must be able to be wrong. Right? This is called being falsifiable. Here are some examples of non-falsifiable claims. The United States never landed on the moon. Right? This is a very simple one. I can't prove a negative, right? You can't produce evidence of something that never happened, right? So the claim that the United States never landed on the moon, we did, by the way, is a non-falsifiable claim. It does not fall within the boundary of science. A giant humanoid ape called Bigfoot lives in the Pacific Northwest. That's a non-falsifiable claim, because I could go out for a year and search for Bigfoot and then come back and say, I didn't find Bigfoot. And all you'd have to do is say, well, you were just looking in the wrong place. Right? Oh, you were looking over here. Turns out Bigfoot was over here. It's a non-falsifiable claim. I can't possibly, I can't reach an endpoint to that question unless I find a Bigfoot, right? That's the only way to do it. And so if Bigfoot doesn't exist, then I can't, there's no resolution to the claim, right? It's non-falsifiable. And then, of course, as we said earlier with empiricism, things that are opinion are non-falsifiable. So chocolate is better than vanilla, right? Purely an opinion. There's no way that if you make that claim that it's true for you, but it could be not true for other people. It just doesn't fall into the world of science. Parsimony. Good scientific theories are parsimonious. Let's say that I study nutrition and I want to understand when people eat salad, why do they lose weight? So I have a theory. People lose weight when they eat salad because all of us have a little monster inside of our body that lives inside of us. And that little monster only likes to eat salad. So when I eat salad, my little stomach monster eats the salad instead, and I end up losing weight because I don't get the calories. What is wrong with this explanation? Obviously, a lot. It's ridiculous, but it's intentionally ridiculous to show the unnecessary complexity that theories can gather when we're not careful about parsimony, right? Like, this could be the case, right? This is actually a falsifiable claim. It falls within the boundaries of science, oddly enough. I could, look inside of people. If I claim that every human has a little monster in their body, I could falsify that. But the theory is just all over the place. It's too complicated. It's too much. It doesn't actually efficiently or effectively explain the phenomena, right? What does explain the phenomena? Well, salads, when you make them correctly, tend to be lower in calories than other food. So people who eat more salad are more likely to have a calorie deficit and thus lose weight. That's it, right? That's the actual scientific explanation, and it's much more parsimonious, right? It fits with what we know, and it efficiently and effectively explains the phenomena. And lastly, we're going to talk a little bit more about this issue of proof. In the world of science, you should think of proof as being along a sliding scale. We don't ever want to make 100% direct, hard and fast claims about most things in science, particularly in the behavioral sciences, where we're talking about like the behavior of human beings. Now, if we're talking about like astrophysics, right? Like we understand the speed of light. The speed of light is the speed of light. Every time we've measured it, it's the same, right? That's as close to something being absolutely 100% proven as you can get, right? So things like that, things like the speed of light in the world of science look like this sort of meter that I'm circling with my laser pointer right now. We are so confident about it, right? We are all the way confident. We are 100% confident that you might as well just go ahead and use the word prove, right? It's never, ever has anyone ever measured the speed of light at anything but exactly what we know the speed of light to be, right? So this is as close to capital P prove as you'll get in the world of science. At the other end would be something that we can disprove, right? So let's take my little monsters who eat salad in your stomach example, right? That's all the way over here, right? Doesn't exist. We have falsified that claim. However, the majority of claims in science, and again, particularly in the behavioral or biological sciences, they're going to fall somewhere in the middle with varying levels and degrees of support. And that needle, that meter, can shift and change over time. And that's the process of science. Something that we thought we were really confident about, we might get some new findings and it brings our confidence down a little, or vice versa. So think about the science of things like nutrition. It feels like every week there's some new study out that says eggs are good for you. No, eggs aren't so good for you. Eating nuts is good for you. Oh, but they're high in calories and fat, right? Nutrition is a difficult thing to study, and because individuals are different, and a whole host of reasons why nutrition is difficult to study. And so we get these sort of back and forth and conflicting, right? Chocolate is good for you. No, chocolate is bad. A glass of wine is good. No, don't drink, right? And so eventually we sort of settle in sort of the middle with moderate levels of confidence, where in the world of health and nutrition, we can say some things very clearly, and then we can say other things not very clearly. So you shouldn't smoke. You shouldn't drink very much. You shouldn't eat a ton of red meat and processed fat and carbs. You should eat a plant-based diet with lots of fish and chicken and healthy fats and the occasional meat, right? Like we can make that broad claim. Generally, that is going to lead to a healthy, nutritious lifestyle. Now, we can bicker about some of the details, of course, but the process of science has sort of back and forth in this meter led us to that, to confidence in that sort of general conclusion. It doesn't prove, right, that if you eat, olives every day, you'll live to be 100, right? That's not how it works. But we can generally say that those things are, we have confidence that those things will make you a generally more healthy person. A nice example of quote unquote proof, right? Again, kind of like the speed of light. The earth is round, I promise, in spite of all you flat earthers out there. Hopefully none in this class, or if you are a flat earther, hopefully by the end you are not, because you will understand the process of science. We can we have made innumerable observations of the world that have shown us that the earth is round. We are confident in that. But interestingly enough, with what we know about astrophysics, it doesn't mean that the earth will always be round. For example, if a massive black hole were to appear in our solar system and start sucking the earth into it, the earth would shift from a sphere and it's actually kind of more oblong, it's a little ovally. The earth would shift from a sphere, and as it gets sucked into the black hole, it would flatten out, right? So the earth could be flat. It would just require the complete destruction of our solar system. So good on you, flat earthers. Again, another classic example of why we don't want to use the word prove in science very often is because, what we think changes, and we update and we correct misinformation from the past. So we used to think that the earth is the center of the solar system or the universe, and that the earth was stationary and the sun rotated around us, right? But now we know, so that's called a geocentric viewpoint. We now know that's not true. We have new data. I mean, this goes back thousands of years, that the universe is heliocentric, meaning the sun is at the center. It's the massive object, the massive star in our solar system, and it's pulling everything else into rotation around it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about basic versus applied questions or problems in science. So we can think about this sliding scale from basic to what we're going to call translational to what we're going to call applied. Applied is the easiest one to understand. Applied research is out in the field where you're actually trying to use science to help people. That's the best way I can explain it. So you're if we sort of harken back to an example from part one, you're a school counselor that's it's going to include mindfulness meditation into your school. Let's actually go measure. Let's have kids do mindfulness meditation, and let's measure the effect on their grades and on their emotional well-being. Right? Let's actually apply it to the scenario in which we are curious about. Right? Let's see, does this help people in the real world? Basic research, on the other end, is research that's done in a laboratory typically, and it's just asking questions about the phenomena. We're not trying to help people yet. We're just trying to understand the phenomena. So if the phenomena is mindfulness meditation, then basic research would be asking questions like, what part of the brain is active when experienced meditators are meditating? Let's just learn about meditation itself, right? And the brain and meditation. That's basic. It's not helping anyone, right? Answering this question, what parts of the brain are active when meditating? If I can answer that question, it still doesn't help anyone. It just provides information. It's knowledge about the phenomena. The idea is that if I develop enough knowledge about the phenomena, if I do enough basic research, I can then take it and I can apply it to actually help people, right? But I have to learn about the phenomena first. I can't jump all the way to applied research. I have to do the basic research first. I have to lay the foundation, and then I can go do the application. And then in the middle is what we call translational research. So if basic research is answering questions in a laboratory about the phenomena. Applied research is answering questions like out in the real world, trying to help people. Translational research is typically research done in a laboratory, but it's bridging the gap between basic and applied research. So for example, in a laboratory study, so not in the real world, not in the field, in a laboratory study, can meditation improve the GRE scores of college students? So that's a translational research question. I have college students come into the lab, they meditate, 3 times a week for a month or whatever, and then I maybe do a pre-post test, or I get them to take some sort of assessment like the GRE, and I see if they do better than students who are not meditating. So it's happening in the lab, but I'm starting to sort of like dip my toe into the applied side of things. It's not yet fully applied because it's still happening not in the real world, it's happening in the laboratory. But I'm asking questions that will lead me to applied research. So that's translational, it's in the middle. And now lastly, let's talk about the publication process. When a scientist completes a study, the purpose of that research is to inform other people, right? It's not just to keep it to yourself, it's to give it out to the world so that we increase our public understanding. The first step in that process is publication in a scientific journal. These are publications that are managed by scientists. The editors of these journals are typically senior members of a field who are well respected and sort of have an encyclopedic knowledge about their area of expertise. And they publish work in that area, and then it gets disseminated to other scientists. So when work is published in an academic journal, the audience is other scientists. The audience is not the public. They are written in such a way that they have lots of technical details, both methodological, statistical, and theoretical. And the idea is that to really fully understand one of these, you have to have some foundation of knowledge about the field or about the process, about experimentation in science. They are not written in such a way where they are easily understandable by the average person. So scientific journals is where scientists publish their findings so that it can be spread to other scientists. And now there are hundreds of these journals. We're just going to talk about psychology here, but know that there are journals in chemistry and medicine and biology and anthropology and physics and engineering, right? There's scientific journals for every field. But just in psychology, there are many, many journals because psychology is a very broad and diverse science. So there are journals that publish personality and social psychology research, journals that publish research about culture and media. So this is a real journal, The Psychology of Popular Media Culture. There are journals that focus on specific groups or demographic groups, like the Asian American Journal of Psychology. And then there are journals that focus on content areas. So the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition. And so each journal publishes a small segment of the overall field. And when you add all these journals together, you have the totality of the field of psychology. The publication process is rigorous. I'm actually an associate editor on a journal called New Ideas in Psychology. The purpose of that journal is to publish sort of new cutting edge research of all kinds across psychology. This process is very involved. So obviously the scientist has to do the work, right? They have to generate the idea, they have to form a hypothesis, they have to do an experiment, collect data, do the analyses, and then write up their experiment. Then they choose a journal that they think would fit their work and they submit it. What happens then is that the editor receives the submission, and generally the editor in chief gets to make a yes or no, a pass fail decision. If they fail them, sorry, this work isn't for us. Either it's not high enough quality or it doesn't fit with the journal, right? It's not the type of thing that we publish. If the paper gets passed, then it goes down to an associate editor, and an associate editor's responsibility is to review the paper. What that means is that, and I do this, when I receive a paper from my editor, I have to go out and I read the paper and digest it so that I understand it. And then I go out and I find at least 3 experts in that field from somewhere in the world. And I ask them to read the paper too and to critique it. What do they think about it? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? Does it deserve to be published? Does it not deserve to be published? Right? We review, right? So it's called peer review because your peers, right, other scientists in the field, other experts in the field are reviewing your work. And this is all done anonymously. So then the editor gets the feedback from the reviewers, and the editor has a decision to make. You can accept the paper as is and shoot it right along for publication. Very rarely happens. You can reject the paper and say, even after review, we decided this paper isn't appropriate. Or you can ask the author to make changes, right, to revise the paper. And that's typically what happens. And maybe there's some things that aren't quite clear. There are some things that need more information. There's some maybe stylistic issues or issues with figures. Maybe, this is all great, but we want to see your data, right? Can you show us your data? And we'll have someone else conduct the analyses to make sure you're doing them correctly. That sort of thing. And this review process can take months. And it involves a lot of back and forth between the editors and the reviewers and the authors. And eventually, the paper might get published in the journal. From the inception of a research idea, so the generation of a hypothesis, all the way to publication, it's not uncommon for that to take a year, 2 years, right? Depending on the project, a decade sometimes, depending on how big and involved the project is. So the timetable on this is quite long because science wants to be self-correcting and self-policing, right? We don't just let anything through to publication. It has to be shown to have legitimate merits and value to the field. And so this whole review process is built so that we do everything we can to only publish good quality work. Once work has been published in a scientific journal, it gets disseminated to scientists in that field. And the next step is journalism. So oftentimes a news reporter, right? So someone who works for CNN, NPR, BBC, CBS, that sort of thing. They employ science journalists whose job it is to read these journals that are coming out, these research articles, and then choose research that might be important or beneficial or that might apply to people, and then to read the article and then write a news report, right? A news article that you might see on CNN.com or something. And that is to be digested by the general public. So by the time the general public digests scientific information, it's gone through multiple stages. And remember, when it's published in a journal, it's not meant to be consumed by the average person. It's meant to be consumed by other scientists. And so we need people like science journalists who understand science, but also understand how to write for the general public to bridge that gap between scientific publication and popular press publication. And so some questions that you always want to ask about science journalism. One, is the story important, right? Does it matter? Or because, science journalists can only write so many stories. They only have so much time. And so they have to choose the stories that they believe will be most important. And then second, is the news report accurate? Do they accurately convey the information in the article? In an ideal world, science journalists are there to translate that research and accurately convey it to the public. However, we don't live in an ideal world. Journalists make honest mistakes where they misinterpret things or they make claims that are not in the article itself. And honest mistakes happen. Unfortunately, maybe the more dangerous issue with science journalism is someone intentionally misleading the public by distorting the truth or twisting words or leaving out important details or twisting it to their bias or their political agenda, and then trying to pass it off as the actual science when in fact the actual science said nothing about that. So for example, this was actually just published like a week ago. It's an article in a very well-respected journal, PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This is the link to the CNN report on that research. And the research was about newborn race and neonatal death rate. So how likely newborns are to die. And what they found is that when a black newborn is cared for by a white doctor, they are 3 times more likely to die than when a black newborn is cared for, and then the average newborn, sorry. Now we know that we have systematic inequities in our medical system when it comes to race. And so black newborns in general are more likely to die, unfortunately, about 2 times. They're about twice as likely to die as white newborns. But what this study found is that when the black newborn was cared for by a white doctor, the rate of infant mortality went from 2 times to 3 times. It actually went up. And so this is a very important, potentially provocative headline, and particularly in a time of some discontent with race issues in the country. And so this science journalist decided this is a really important thing to write about. And so if we wanted to, we could actually go read the original article. I did, the scientific article in PNAS, and then we could compare it to the journalist writing on CNN. And here I've got some screenshots if you want to take a look. This is the actual text from the CNN article that was published. And I read this multiple times. I actually went and found the original paper and read the published scientific paper. And this, if you want to take a few minutes to read through it, is a fantastic example of good science journalism. They very clearly and very simply convey what happened, what was the research question, what were the results, some important methodological information, like the data analyzed were on 1.8 million hospital births. That's a lot of data in the state of Florida, and only Florida, which is interesting, right? That's possibly what we might call a confound. This might not be a perfectly representative sample of the country, but with a data set that size, 1.8 million, and in a state as diverse as Florida, we tend to maybe not worry so much about that. The births occurred between 92 and 2015, right? All of this sort of methodological detail. They go on to interview and quote the lead author on the study. And they make it a point that the authors, and I'm going to highlight here with my laser pointer, do not speculate about the reasons behind this trend. But what the authors are trying to do is say, quote, Taken with this work, it gives warrant for hospitals and other care organizations to invest in efforts to reduce such biases and explore their connection to institutional racism. So the authors are not claiming to know why this is happening. They're just saying it is happening, and we need to know about it because we need to start looking at ways to mitigate this and how to change this. And so the topic is important. The article is well written and comprehensive. I checked the accuracy of it, and it's pretty accurate. It's a very good example of science journalism. So if you want to read the actual article itself, you can click on this hyperlink that's within this link. It might be behind a paywall, unfortunately, but you should at least be able to get access to like a summary of the actual journal. If you really want to work around the paywall and get access to it, you can just use the Georgia State Library. We have databases of scientific journals, and you should be able to get access to it through there. Okay, so this is all to say that the creation of science, the publication of science, the evaluation of science, and then the dissemination of science is a long, difficult, and complicated process. It's not something that you can learn in a semester. This course is going to work towards building you a foundation in those in the skill sets that you would need to do that. And the majority of the time you interact with science, it's going to be at the interface of science journalism, like we just saw, BBC, CNN, NPR, New York Times, that sort of stuff. And that's important because science journalism has some substantial risks and benefits, right? The risks are misinforming the public. The benefits are, that we get to distribute information to a large population, that the distribution of this information might actually help us apply these findings to help better the lives of, millions of people. And so science journalism is needed and is necessary, and we've seen a really good example of it. Unfortunately, you don't always see good examples of it. Unfortunately, some journalists end up misinforming the population, whether intentionally or unintentionally. It's still a potential danger. Okay, that's it for part 2. I hope you enjoyed the end of chapter 1. I will see you again. Excuse me. I will see you again for chapter 2. So until next time, have a good one.